Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I have just a few slides to talk, but I'm going to just, initially I wasn't going to have any slides, and then I was inspired to share stories of two of my patients where clinical trials really made a difference. But my opening thoughts, I was asked to discuss, what really are clinical trials? And I think this is a very educated audience. I probably don't need to explain the full concept to you, but at the end of the day, it's the mechanism and the way we're able to test new treatments and generate data that's going to help us drive the field forward. And most of the time, we have trials set up into, 3 different categories. A phase 1 trial, which is where you're looking to see a signal of efficacy, and you're also looking to see if the treatment is safe. And so, I think the phase 1 trials have really changed over the years from being an area where, we were just really looking to see if a combination was tolerable to actually studies that can drive even a registration strategy and bring the drug to market, once an evidence of activity is noted. And that's exactly what happened with the arrival of the anti-PD-1 agents that we now use so frequently. Phase 2 studies are usually geared a little bit more to enhance a signal of efficacy, and by the time we get to a phase 3 trial, we're trying to compare whatever the novel treatment it is versus whatever standard of care is in use, with the hope that we'll see a measurable difference that would allow us to change practice. So what roles do clinical trials serve in patient care? I actually, I will parrot a phrase that my colleagues at Stanford use that I love, which is that I believe truly that research is the standard of care. That doesn't mean that a clinical trial is right for every patient, but I think that most very robust clinical trial portfolios will have, if there are effective standard of care agents available, will have those agents incorporated into their research portfolio in some way, shape, or form. For instance, I'll take our trial at NYU that I referenced during our previous discussion. Immunotherapy is a very highly effective tool for the treatment of melanoma, and we'd be crazy to have a trial portfolio without an immunotherapy-based regimen first line. But what are we doing? We're trying to add agents that might mitigate the toxicity of immunotherapy to make that current standard better. So I truly do believe that research is the standard of care. That being said, I'm also very cognizant of the fact that financial toxicity and access to trials are very real obstacles to all patients in the country receiving a clinical trial. And so I think that we have to be very practical in understanding that there are certain trials we'll be able to conduct in certain areas of the country, but for other areas of the country that perhaps don't have those same resources, we need to think bigger and think differently about how we might shape our landscape to make sure that we're reaching all of our patients. In terms of the role of placebo in clinical trial, I think, especially when we're dealing with stage 4 disease, in general, we try to avoid studies that have a placebo arm, although there might be studies where patients don't get the experimental agent. They might get randomized to the, quote, current standard of care. Placebos, we just do use sometimes in our adjuvant studies with the assumption that, again, some of these patients may have already been cured by surgery. And so the difference, there is, again, is a standard of care or is actual treatment even necessary in that situation? And so in that place, we may sometimes still use placebos as part of our work. And so benefits and risks for participants. I think, all of us, every single one of us that enrolls a patient to a trial, we're hoping to see more benefit than risk. That being said, whenever you're trying something new, there's an element of risk. And every physician who is enrolling patients to clinical protocols must spend time in an informed consent process where we actually, as clearly as possible, disclose as many of the risks that we can possibly think of and acknowledge that we don't even know all the risks because it's an unknown. And I think that is always, to me, one of the most emotionally charged parts of clinical research. I'm always incredibly impressed at the bravery of my patients that do participate, because no matter what, no matter how much data we have, there is still an element of an unknown. And patients that participate in clinical research do have to, in their gut, be comfortable with that. So I'm going to just glaze quickly through these two anecdotes because they're very meaningful to me in terms of how clinical research really changed two of my patients' lives. So something to know about me: I am a Jersey girl at heart. I was born in a small town called Bradley Beach, which is near Asbury Park, New Jersey, for those of you that may have heard of that, because it's produced some very famous musicians. I moved back there in July, actually, from a mile from where my parents. And what's really wonderful about practicing and living in that area of the country is you do, I think, it is impossible to not, ultimately cross paths with people you may know in your community. And there's no greater privilege for me than to take care of somebody who I've either grown up with or, I've grown up with their children and for a loved family member to me. But both of these patients had some of those connections, and so I want to share these very meaningful stories. This isn't it. Oh, there we go. So meet Larry. Larry is actually lives just a couple miles down the road from me. I've known his daughter for much of my life. She was a beach badge checker during the summer times, which is a great job. I highly suggest that gig if you can get it. He was 39 years old in 2005 when we met for the first time. And at 47, he was diagnosed with stage 4 disease. And so in my office, talking about, his daughters who were my age, who I knew, and trying to understand what the future might hold for him was a really emotionally charged conversation. So we immediately began talking about clinical research. And at the time, the buzz had already started to build about anti-PD-1 therapy, but it was not necessarily widely available everywhere. But we did have a burgeoning clinical research portfolio, and ipilimumab, I believe, had already had its approval and was part of a clinical trial called ECOG 3611, which was a 4-quadrant study that randomized patients either to ipi alone, interferon alone, or the combination at 2 different doses. And so he was able to participate frontline in that trial because that was what was available at the time. He had progression almost immediately, and in the background, the buzz is building about anti-PD-1 therapy, and the train was leaving. And what I mean by what the train being leaving is any of you who might have had to search for clinical trials for yourselves or for a loved one, understanding what happens by the time there's enough information out that a drug may be particularly effective, it may be time for that trial to actually start closing down, and then there's a gap between when it's actually available to patients. And that was actually exactly what was happening to Larry. There are some significant barriers we faced with Larry. Clinical research processes and activation timelines being one of them. So in my administrative role at NYU, I have made it my mission in life to make sure that our clinical research program runs like a well-oiled machine. And it's a very hard job to do. And I can't say that I've been tremendously successful about it, but I do think we have got it into a really good place, at least right now. And so I learned from, watching, this particular study in my mind, which is Keynote 002, and was randomizing pembrolizumab at 2 different doses to chemotherapy in patients for whom ipilimumab had not been effective. Sometimes when you're waiting for a research protocol to open, it's like watching paint dry. And you just can't, no matter how many times you're trying to push the rock uphill and talk to the IRB or talk to the contracts people, it just wasn't moving. And that's what was happening to Larry. But we finally got it open. I believe I got it open. I had a whole 9 weeks. I enrolled something like 19 patients in those 9 weeks because that's how significant the demand was in New Jersey. There was no other site in Jersey that had access to this study. Insurance. So while we were waiting for all this to happen, I was obviously calling my colleagues at other centers asking, can you please make room for my patient? His insurance wouldn't let him go out of state. So again, we're talking about financial toxicity and making research accessible. This is still an enormous problem that we all face, especially now with the rise of healthcare systems that really want to incentivize patients to stay within their network. Larry's work schedule was very important for him to keep his job. He was a sole breadwinner for his family, and that was also where his health insurance was coming from. Impending need for surgery. So Larry needed a hip replacement, and as the study was written, once he went on the trial, he was not going to be able to have that surgery. And the hip MRI part was ordered, and it was ready to go, and we could work out the timing so that way we could procure one of these slots that were going to be gone if we didn't act really quickly. But I needed to get his surgeon on board. So I called his surgeon, and what I thought was a very nice conversation said, I really, really need you to operate on this patient next week. And he said, okay. He said it wouldn't be a problem. But my husband's an anesthesiologist, and apparently the next morning he walked into the operating room and said, I can't believe you're married to that woman. She has the gall to tell me what to do. What does she tell you? And so my husband said, well, what did she do? And so he told him. And I said, well, what did you say? He said, I was never more proud of you. So the point being that timing and advocacy from your physician is so critical with this kind of stuff. I think that, again, all these things were coalescing. Are we going to get this patient on this study? So we finally did. But then once you get past all that, I'll never forget this conversation. He's like, well, what do you mean I might not get the drug? Which spot on the curve am I assigned to? And so this is from the Lancet paper, the final paper that looked at this data. And clearly the patients who actually got the spot on the anti-PD-1 arm did do better than those who got chemotherapy. And that is just the way, unfortunately, we have to do clinical research right now. But these are the cold hard facts, right? That sometimes you're not assigned on the curve that did better. Larry was assigned on the curve that did better. He did have some bumps in the road. He wound up with grade 3 toxicity in the form of myalgias that required hospitalization. He was no evidence of disease after his second dose. He was maintained on 5 milligrams of prednisone, which he continues on till this day. And he comes to visit me in New York City, where he transferred his care when I moved from Rutgers, and makes a day out of it, which makes me really very happy. My second patient is Harry, his real name. I didn't make up that the name's rhyme. Harry was 60 when he was diagnosed in 2009. Incredibly rapid development of stage 4 disease, progressed like wildfire. And again, the buzz was building and the train was leaving about something called a BRAF inhibitor. Again, this is a place where clinical research process, again, really did interfere with the care I was able to give my patients. No site in New Jersey was selected to be part of these trials. If you wanted to go, you had to pack your bags and travel. Thankfully, my colleagues at Penn were, again, incredibly accommodating. I knew Penn had the trial open. I called them up. Again, insurance was a huge issue. I believe that Harry wound up paying a significant portion of his care out of pocket because there just was no choice. And then there was the problem of tissue, okay? So now something we do so routinely to just get genomic sequencing or IHC, which is sometimes still a little bit tricky, really difficult to actually get somebody to cut his slides to get him on trial in time to get one of these final slots. And then, of course, while all this was happening, we finally get him enrolled, consented, gets to Penn, signs the consent form, and then winds up in an ICU somewhere in southern Jersey with really, really bad pleural disease. Somehow we were able to convince folks to let us administer the medicine in the ICU. His pleural effusions has improved, his pulmonary masses has improved. I called his wife 10 days later and she said, Dr. Mehnert, all of a sudden we're talking about living instead of dying. So Larry walked his daughter down the aisle 4 months later for a wedding. He did ultimately relapse and die from his disease. But the point being, timing, advocacy, and just the power of, having someone who's gonna push that rock uphill. I'll never forget my research coordinators just harassing the pathology department. You've just gotta release these slides. You just have to help us. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes from clinical research, and I'm so grateful to the teams that make it happen every day. We, the physicians, get to stand up on the podium and discuss all the results, but there's a whole army behind us that is really, and of course our colleagues in pharma as well. So on that note, I'm gonna close so we can transition to our panel discussion. But clearly, I'm a believer in how powerful clinical research is and how necessary it is for us to advance our field. And I want to start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and share a bit about their melanoma journey.
First? Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Leah Adams, and I am a stage 1A melanoma survivor. I'm also a daughter of a metastatic melanoma fighter, my father. And I'm here today to tell my story of how research has impacted my life and how both me and my father have been involved in research over the last couple years. If there were no research, there would be no treatments. And if that was the case, we would not be taking those steps towards a cure. So that's why I'm here, and that's a little bit about me.
Hi, I'm Colleen Wittoesch, and I'm sitting here today because I was on a phase 2 clinical trial at MD Anderson Cancer Center for metastatic melanoma stage 4 of the brain. I had no metastases anywhere else. I was given an option, thank you, because I'd like hearing about those clinical trials. I was not given an option anywhere else with the brain metastases because of being told, we have nothing for you. And so in 2016, when the IPI and NIVO opened up, I was with my oncologist, Dr. Amaria, one heck of a care team. I have beautiful daughters that supported me, my family, friends, that when we looked at what I was going to do, I had 5 months to live. So I had an option, clinical trial that had just came out, new drugs to be able to actually attack those tumors in my brain, to get past that blood-brain barrier, which is what they wanted to do, and that's what I wanted. I had other options, but I knew at that time and what I was facing that to save my life was the route I was going to take. I had faith in the researchers. They put decades of years into their study. It's not something that's just totally new. It's new, but I had such faith in their commitment to the study that they have done for so many years. And so I'm sitting here today because of that.
Hi, I'm Chris White. I'm a mucosal melanoma survivor, thriver, and advocate. I was diagnosed with mucosal melanoma when I was 36 years old, had no clue that it even existed, and that had nothing to do with the sun. I spent about 18 months trying every treatment that existed at the time, fighting the side effects and everything else that goes along with it, until I finally was able to get into a clinical trial for TIL therapy, which Dr. Patel was actually talking about earlier. And I had to fight my way. I got into the trial and I actually had to fight my way back into it because I got kicked out. And so, not to anybody's fault, but I ended up having a brain metastasis and that's an exclusion. And so I had to self-advocate. It's one of the main themes I talk about often. But I was able to stabilize my brain metastasis, get back in the trial, and I was the last person to be dosed in the phase 2 cohort 4 of that trial in January of 2020. Mm-hmm. And within less than a year, about 9 months, they were able to tell me that I had a confirmed complete metabolic response, and I've scanned clear ever since. And so, thank you. That's me, and that's why I'm here. I shared my experience about self-advocating rare melanomas and TIL, and here we are.
Excellent. So we've got a series of questions, and I think we actually, have a decent amount of time. So I think we can sort of just start by, going, through all of you and asking, would you mind just sharing a bit about your experience participating in the study? So you all gave a little blurb, but tell us something that stands out in your experience, something you learned from, or that you think others can learn from.
Well, so my story is a little bit unique because my father and I were not in clinical trials, but we both decided to enroll in clinical research. So he and I both have received care at Cleveland Clinic Taussig Cancer Center, and we first started hearing about some research studies because of our family history. So I was diagnosed with stage 1 melanoma back in 2019. My father originally had stage 0 melanoma a month before my stage 1. And then his melanoma came back 2 years later, stage 4 metastatic in his brain and lungs. So when I first got diagnosed with my melanoma, stage 1, I was told about a genetic research study that was going on because they were aware of my father's stage 0. They were also aware of my grandfather's, which is my father's father's, history of skin cancer. So there's clearly a genetic component in our family on my dad's side with skin cancer. So I enrolled in the study back in 2019, and then 2 years later, my father enrolled in the study as well. And there is still being a lot of data collected in this study in Cleveland, but they basically are coming to terms with that there's clearly a genetic component to melanoma. We've seen it in our family, and both my father and I want to be a part of research because if it weren't for research, we would not be seeing the success we're hearing today. We would have not gotten this far from 2011. We all saw those slides and that data, and that is huge. That is huge strides to success. And so that's a little bit about, the study that both my father and I are in, and then my dad most recently enrolled in a study given his brain mets that he has. It's a study that's showing brain necrosis after receiving gamma knife radiation in the brain, which some of you may be familiar with, that when an individual has that in their brain, when they get a scan, sometimes a scan can pick up something that looks like disease progression, where it actually could be just brain necrosis. And my father was a candidate for it, and he has been in this study also at the Cleveland Clinic. And me and my mom kind of told him, hey, Dad, you may want to enroll in that. And he's like, okay, I will do that. So, because he knows that deep down that, if it weren't for us, participating in this clinical research, we wouldn't get this profound data that is showing so much promise and hope in getting closer to a cure for melanoma. So that's a little bit about our story.
The reason for the clinical trial, the phase 2 in 2016, wasn't just for, well, it was first to save my life, to be there with my family, my daughters, but to be able to have the research available for other patients that come across, that I know if we could get through the clinical trial, that we could have the data that the researchers can use, we could see how a patient reacts to the new avenue that they wanted to take, and to really be able to have something for patients with brain metastases. Because nothing is worse than going in to a doctor and having to be told we have nothing for you. So being able to have that at that time and have that opportunity made me want to fight for myself, fight for the researchers, and fight for the advancement of the cure for melanoma. Because without research, and Dr. Mehnert said that right, research should be the standard of care. That's the way I look at it. The dedication for that. And it takes a lot of people that come as a team that want to work on these clinical trials. First, the patient that wants to participate in the clinical trial. Then the family members, because they are affected just as much as the patient is, not physically, but emotionally, mentally. Your care team, building a relationship with your care team, I can tell everybody, is one of the biggest positive things that you can do that can keep you going forward in that treatment. Because you have days that are like, there are some days. And then you have days that are like, they're behind me, I got it, I can talk to them, I can ask these questions, I can say whatever I want. The one thing about my care team at MD Anderson with Dr. Maria, she said, I don't care if it looks like a purple dot on your foot, you're to tell me everything that's happening in your body. Because being a phase 2 clinical trial, we're kind of learning together. And I had that support like that to feel that I'm helping them as they're helping me and to get through. And I am the longest patient in melanoma to be on that clinical trial. And I was given an opportunity to extend that trial. They asked me, with Colleen, your response has been so good. We would like to your body. My body was able to take it. I did have toxicity. I was in the ER at times. You learn how to get those patterns, what you're doing, what's affecting your body. But when they came to me and asked me if I would extend the treatment, I was more than happy because I felt I was training those T cells. My body's gonna fight this. It's gonna get extra opportunities to get me to a place where I could be on that tail that MD Anderson looks at to say, like Dr. Davis said, 7 years because that's all we have. So I started in 2016 with that. And the one thing that I want people to understand, and I get phone calls from a lot of patients with brain metastases, may not be melanoma, and they'll talk to me. And I say to them, listen, ask your oncologist, ask your team, is there a clinical trial? There may not be one now, there may be one coming, but feel free to ask that question first and then see where that goes, because clinical trials do not have to be your last resort, your last choice of treatment. What you want to do for your treatment is your own choice. But a clinical trial doesn't have to be like I would hear when we see it. Everybody says, I don't want to be tested on, I don't want to be a guinea pig. But your oncologist team and that want the best results for you, the same thing that you want, they want. They're going to look to make sure that you do not get to such a level that you can't have the alternatives of treatment. And I did have 4 other alternatives for treatment. It was the clinical trial, and then we discussed the other 4. And then you have to qualify for a clinical trial. You can say you want it, which I did, but I had to wait to make sure I had a certain tumor size, and I had to wait to make sure that I was going to be able to be eligible to be on the trial. And the day that came in and said, yes, you have the tumor size, you can do it, we were celebrating. I know it sounds weird, but we were all like, yeah, Mom! And we did. And I think a lot of people need to understand with that factor. There's a lot that goes in behind it because they want to make sure. The toxicity will happen with a lot of treatments. And with new drugs and that, we don't know. But then when you see the results of where I'm sitting right now, look what you do know. So I try to encourage the education and the open conversations. Like Chris was saying, be your own advocate. All steps of the way, be your own advocate. And they don't mind. They don't. They want to hear. The more you can talk, the more you give them the information, the more that they can help with the research and advance you, to where you need to be. So I'm, as you can tell, a major advocate for the clinical trials. And I know that Dr. Mehnert was saying, and I did have an insurance issue. I had to change insurance to get an insurance company to take a phase 2 clinical trial. And you better believe we fought to get that. But the other thing is, I sit on a lot of conferences I go to. I sit and I work with a lot of major organizations, I'm not going to say them all, and to put that forth on what's the biggest barrier for a clinical trial. First, it's finances, insurance, and location. So one of the things that's been said and out and about is that they're trying to decentralize a lot of clinical trials to give that accessibility, if they can do that, to patients so they can have it. Because I think the percentage of people who get into clinical trials is less than 20%. There will actually be, and a lot of it, I've talked to a lot of patients. I've had to stop it because I can't keep flying, I have no money, I can't get to here. So the one thing, and the industry sees it, they know it, and that what they're trying to do is see how they can get it, more participation, decentralize it, get the access to what I had, because I live in Houston, Texas. So I'm 20 minutes from MD Anderson, and I was a volunteer patient advocate there for 14 years in the melanoma clinic. And then I walk in as a patient, but also in the EC. So I've heard what patients' needs are and what they have. And those for a clinical trial are the biggest blocks that we would like to see everybody try to find a way to get the accessibility. So, now Chris.
So one of the things I tell, or I like to speak and advocate for, basically from my own experience, is you don't know what you need to know until you need to know it. And so when I had started my journey, I had no idea that you could get melanoma where the sun doesn't shine. It made no sense to me, so I was already started off on a rare track. And by the time I got to an expert, I had already done a couple of different surgeries, but one of the things that I've always respected from the first oncologist I saw, and I've been to 3 major organizations throughout all of my treatment, but she immediately told me that she was not an expert in this, is a very rare type of melanoma, and I should see a specialist. And so I always could sense that sense of urgency and respect that out of her. And so when I did get to my specialist, I didn't actually qualify at the time for the trial that I eventually got into that saved my life. And so we went down the path of all the different treatments that were available. And in fact, I had so many different treatments, a lot of them overlapped each other, and some of the first actual clinical trial I was in was doing radiation and immunotherapy at the same time. And for me, I was willing to do anything and everything I had to do because my will to live was that strong. And so I knew I was with the experts, and they were just extremely smart. And so I had a major positive attitude. I was, just so enthralled with, healthy habits, healthy eating, anything that could possibly lead me down the correct path. And so I eventually ran out of options. And when that happened, that's when I was told, hey, you know, this is what you should do. You should do TIL therapy. But the organization I was at didn't have it at the time. But I pointed me to a place that did. So I always respected him immensely for doing that, because, you know, he's couldn't necessarily help me, but he definitely knew that I was down to do anything I needed to do and go anywhere I needed to go and break any barriers. But all of the oncologists I worked with, they were partners with me, you know, patients as partners. And so everything was engagement back and forth with, you know, here's the different options. What do you think? I would ask the questions, you know, costs, possible side effects, you know, anything that had to go with it. But, you know, I didn't know to ask these very questions when I very first started on my journey. You know, it was kind of like a learning curve. So, you know, when I say you don't know what you need to know until today, I learned.
Until.
Exactly. But
That's good.
it was just such an experience. And so it's something you just, you know, one, with advocating for yourself, and two, just mainly knowing that it doesn't always have to necessarily be a last option. You know, if you're approached with it, or, you know, just even ask up front, hey, what are the clinical trials? Because in my case, you know, there was different approved therapies and ones that were, you know, in other process of being approved, but I did all of those first. And so you can oftentimes not be strong enough, or maybe disqualify yourself, you know, to get into one. And so, you know, the healthier you are going into a trial, you know, the better, you know, it would be to get through it. And so if you can do a clinical trial first, and then, you know, you have A, B, C, D, or B, C, D, and F to fall back on, rather than doing A, B, C first, and then having clinical trial be like D and E. And so, but yeah, always advocate for yourself, and two, you know, ask what are the options for clinical trials? Is there anything going on? Where are they at? You know, what resources can I look into? What about for my caregivers? Is there any type of reimbursements? You know, will insurance cover it? There's so many different factors, but, you know, mainly if you know to ask for it up front, or just even inquire about it, but ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask the questions. Like I said, you know, you don't know what you need to know until you need to know it. And so, unfortunately, I only knew like what movies and TV had showed me when I first got diagnosed with cancer. And so the goal is to just put enough emphasis out there to engage with your medical team and get that going. So
That's right, Chris.
Absolutely.
So when you all first started discussing trials, what were your questions? What were your concerns? Were you afraid? And how did you address it?
When I went in discussing the trial, the first thing I was asking was, of course, finances, what was going to be covered, what was not. And on clinical trials, you're in a clinical trial, the trial part is covered. Anything outside of the trial, you have to pay for, like my emergency visits, but that type of thing. Then I also wanted to know the researchers, what they were specifically looking at. I knew that they were targeting brain metastases, which is what I had. So I knew that there were not a lot of other options that were out there for me at the stage 4 with 5 months to live. For me, I didn't have as many besides the insurance. That was one of the major blocks in the beginning to get through, to get the insurance coverage. For me, living in Houston and being close to MD Anderson made it more accessible for me to go to treatments. My treatments were twice a month, every 2 weeks for over close to 3 years. So I knew that being there and the logistics of it was easier for me. The other, with the trying to understand the medical side, I knew that I was going to be learning as we went through. So one of the things, because I had a little background of being around melanoma, I had heard of immunotherapy, but never knew really what was out there with it, because it was pretty new for my diagnosis in 2016. There was not a lot of immunotherapy out there. And what I see today just gives me so much joy to see that this has come to such a great avenue with that. The rest of being on the clinical trial was how long. And then what happens if I don't last? What if I have to get off because of the toxicity in the clinical trial? What do I have next? And that's when my care team with Dr. Maria, we sat down and she said, you have options. And one option was actually using one of the drugs on the combo immunotherapy. That would be a second part for me. So I was, okay, let's do this. So I had the confidence in the fact that if I couldn't make it through, that I had other options. And like what Chris was saying, you never know, if I didn't make it through, maybe there's another clinical trial that might come about that for where I was open and ready to use any type of research that was out there. Because I knew my diagnosis was pretty bad. So I was ready to take the risk, as in, let's go and see what new research and the new drugs that are not available publicly at the time are going to do. And that's when I was like, that's what I wanted. Yeah, I had no other options for me.
So the first question I had when I finally was able to inquire about TIL was, where's the dotted line? And I needed my oncologist to explain to me the whole process, because he had first mentioned that it was like immunotherapy, to where it was specifically targeted, and used my immune system. But it's, he had to break down the whole process for me. But he had to explain it in such a simple way that I'm like, oh, okay, I got you. And it was essentially, where they just take a tumor, and I had one in my groin that was a lymph node they could pull, but send it off into a lab. And grow it into the billions, and while it's growing into the billions, I get prepped up and do everything, get ready for the hospital stay. And he said that you got to think of it like your cells are like Pac-Man, and when they expand them and grow them into the billions and then put them back in you, they're like an overwhelming army. And then once they hit you with the IL-2 to activate it, it's like throwing a match on the fire. And it sends the Pac-Man throughout your body, and it eats up all the cells like all the dots and cherries. And so I had that visual in my head, and I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And so, it was literally just, the language and how he explained it to me, the vernacular he used. And so I'm like, okay, that totally makes sense. It doesn't sound so crazy anymore. I'm down, And so, but the other questions obviously was insurance, location, travel, how long's a hospital stay. And so it was all these different little logistics that go along with the whole process, because it's not like you just go in for a fusion and leave. I mean, you live at the hospital for like half a month. I fortunately was able to get in and out within 12 days, but I still had to go back in for a couple of times. So, you have to stay within a certain location for a few days before you can, leave back to town. So there's so many different little factors, but, we were able just to take as many notes as possible, spend as much time. But, anything that you could possibly think of when you have to leave town for a month, we were asking those questions. And so, I also was inquiring about, is there other survivors? What about my specific subtype? Is there anything I could look at, but anything I could engage with to where I can prepare myself, what I need, what kind of clothes would I be needing? Are they going to be cool with me bringing in, my own things from the house, blankets, pillows, because, they're always falling off the bed at the hospital, and stuff. And so, what kind of things am I going to need to prepare for this? Even though they tell you what the possible side effects are they going to happen? What are the, just everything you could possibly think of. And so, mainly, the questions just went until I was done asking them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Excellent. So what was we sort of covered this a little bit. Was there a final motivating factor that just made it crystal clear that this was the right thing to do?
Yeah, my 2 daughters. That's it. Besides me.
That's an excellent answer. That's an excellent answer.
Yeah, and the rest of my family. Yeah.
All of my nieces and nephews, Uncle Chris, I can't, I was just getting started with life. I'm not ready to leave it.
Yeah.
So, mainly my will to live,
Yeah. You do.
I mean, I was going to do anything I had to do. I was going to drink a gallon of gasoline if that's what I had to do. I didn't care. I was going down. I wasn't going down without a fight, and so
Yeah.
I was willing to do whatever I had
Yeah,
to.
you do, Chris. You do.
So Leah, your situation was a little different. You were done with treatment and you signed on for a trial that had more like extra work without an immediate return. So can you talk about your motivation for that?
Yeah, I think I just really realized that if it's not for brave individuals that are willing to put themselves out there and enroll in clinical research or clinical trials, we would not have come this far over the last 15 years. And
Yep.
yeah, that's true. And because of people like Colleen and Chris, my dad would have not immediately got into treatment right away. I mean, because these two were treated years ago. My dad, to this day, doing a combo treatment of immunotherapy for 21 rounds,
Yep.
7 rounds of gamma knife radiation. He is stable today in the brain and lungs because of this treatment, because every single treatment at one point in time was a clinical trial. It always has to start somewhere. And if we have the courage and bravery to put ourselves out there and remind ourselves, why are we doing this? We're either doing it for ourselves or our loved ones, or honestly the future. Because we have to do what we can now in the present to impact the future generations of cancer patients. And so my thing was, if I can just do what I can do as a lower stage survivor that could potentially impact other lower stage survivors or beyond, I'm gonna do it. I don't care about the blood work. I don't care about, being enrolled in all these different other potential future studies that come out. Every skin check I go to, every 3 to 4 months, I always ask my dermatologist, so do you have another research study I can get involved in? And he always laughs, but he is so grateful for that, because some people are afraid to get involved with research. And I know it's scary, but ultimately when you hear all the data and the studies that are shown here today, this is because of people taking the step to get involved. And that can truly save so many future lives. So that's why I got involved. That's why my father got involved. And if you're sitting here today and you're wondering, or if you're tuning in virtually and you're wondering, is a clinical trial or clinical research maybe a possibility for me, just try to take those steps in the right direction, and you'd be surprised what can unfold.
Yep. Hey, Leah. Good girl. You did it.
So what are some of the biggest misconceptions you've heard about clinical trials?
For me, when people would call me and ask me, why are you on that drug? Is that just toxic? They're using you, like, quote, the guinea pig, whatever. Those type of things. And, it's just going to cost so much. It's just going to do this. And I think those misconceptions are out there because people don't know where to go and get the answers that they need, the resources. Resources are a huge tool for anybody, cancer patients, heart, whatever it is, to show you what's available, what's out there, and what you can do. And a lot of people, I just spoke with a gentleman who has glioblastoma, but he knew I went through a clinical trial. And we spoke for about an hour, and I gave him the power to say, you can ask your doctor. You can ask about a clinical trial. Just be your own advocate. You can take the time to say yes or no, hopefully, but that you don't have to look at it as a way that they're just, don't think about, they're just thinking about the drug, what they're going to get out of it. They think about the patient. They really, truly think about the patient. And so we spoke for about an hour, and he said, I feel much more relaxed about going in and asking about one. Not to say that I may go on one, but I feel comfortable now going in and saying, it's okay if I ask my oncologist this. It's okay if I ask, if you're in a trial. I had 3 clinical research nurses because I kept advancing in the trial, right? And I built a relationship with every single one of them. Everyone. They know my kids' names, they know this, but they also know I would be on that email or saying, this is this, what's that, and they would respond. I mean, I'd give them a day. I didn't give them 2 days or 3 days, but I mean, it's really building a relationship and talking to people and feeling, because I know a lot of patients through my advocacy work, at MD Anderson with cancer patients. They always felt if they asked the oncologist, if I upset him or they get angry, he or she, that it's going to interfere with their treatment. And I'm like, it's the total opposite. You know, they want to hear from you. They want to hear your anxiety and things like that, you know, whatever it is. But it's not going to stop your treatment being any different because you want to ask the questions. And a lot of people feel that way. But it's like Chris says, you have to be your own advocate. Empower yourself. When you empower a cancer patient, you give them a little bit more strength for themselves to go through the process, especially beyond a clinical trial. But if you're not, it empowers them. You have a right to ask that. You have a right to say this. It is you. It's your body. And they know it. But don't feel that you have to step back to be able to feel you're going to get the optimal care, because it's the total opposite. And so those are the things, you know, going through with people with the clinical trials and that. Just look at the research. Look at and I'll say it over and over, the researchers, the dedication that these doctors put in to get that cure. And I know some people say cure, you know, and don't want to use it. I like using it. So, I mean, I'm going to say that. I have no evidence of disease. I take it day by day, scans. I had, in 2016, I'd had adjuvant. That's what I had. I had to have tumors removed to save my life to get on the clinical trial, because there was nothing. There was no neoadjuvant in 2016 for brain metastases. So I had to have 3 tumors removed at the front lobe of my brain, and then go into the melanoma clinic. And it was almost like a serendipitous. The years I worked, sat on lean Kaizans with the melanoma clinic, and I walk in as one of their very stage 4 metastatic. A melanoma oncologist does not want to see their patient coming in like that. And they knew me. They knew me walking down that hall. They knew me coming in, and I thought, well, I know where I am. I'm in a good place. I know these people, so I'm going to do it. It's a familiarity that I think a lot of people have an issue with clinical trials. I think it needs to be out there more. I think it needs to be an education so that people aren't always looking like this fear when you say clinical trial, instead of looking at how do you think that these drugs, how do you think the survival rate for this disease or cancers have come to where they have come. I mean, it's what we have to do, like Leah was saying, to get to that step with that. But I want people to feel comfortable. I don't want them to feel that, oh, clinical trial, I can't do this, or this is going to do it to me. I want them to, I sat at the table at the clinical trial luncheon, and there are several people that were there that want to educate themselves about it. And that's what you want. And they don't, they're in good health, they don't need the clinical trial, but they want to know about it. And I said, you could be the best advocate for somebody, because you might be in a grocery line with somebody and you hear them talk, and then you hear the fear, but you could be the one that says in the advocacy, I can show you where to go, I can help you, don't have the fear, at least from just looking into being on a clinical trial. And I think that's what I want to see. My background is in science, so I love researchers. I did that, you know, in the geophysics, so I knew when I was coming in with researchers, I was comfortable, but a lot of people are not comfortable, so I want to see them get comfortable with looking at a clinical trial, educating themselves, not have that fear to look at it. It doesn't mean, I mean, when I told some of my friends, my family, we were all on board, that I was on a clinical trial, they were like, oh, well, she's not going to make it, oh, that's not going to be good, and I'm like, yeah, watch. You watch. Absolutely watch. I'm like, I'm not looking at it that way. I feel great that I got eligible to do it, and I felt great that I got on it, and I took it, you know, 6-week scans at a time. I did. And that's what you do. And then now I'm down to once every year.
Wow.
Yeah, so, yeah.
I think you make some really important points that, so it is true, and I always tell patients, I treat, you know, whether my patients are on trial or not on trial, everybody gets the same devotion from my team. But I think what you have to recognize is just by virtue of the frequent touch points that are required on a study, it is impossible not to pay more attention to our patients who are on clinical trials.
Yeah.
So I think that's an enormous advantage that we sometimes, you know, and again, as a physician, you always want to make sure you're putting all the options in front of the patient and helping the patient meet their goals, not your goals. But it's just a fact.
Yep.
It's a fact that, you know, just by virtue on being on a study, you have more exposure to your care team.
Yeah.
So I think I've heard some important themes here, that clinical trials are a viable option from day one, and not just a last resort. You have the right to ask for a trial. That is not something you should feel that is extra or taking the doctor's time. I mean, the only reason I can imagine anyone would discourage that is if they just aren't, it's not in their comfort zone, and hopefully, if that's the case, they know where to refer to you to if that's something that's in your interest. Advocating for yourself is important, and that may include, if you're unsatisfied with the information that's given to you, getting a second opinion at an NCI designated cancer center. And within this day and age with telemedicine, that's easier than ever before. But I also think, and obviously I have a bias here, but certainly even in melanoma, I think it's not just an NCI center, it's got to be a center that has a strong melanoma program. Yeah. Melanoma, even though it's much more, I think it's more common than we ever suspected and incidences have risen, at the end of the day, it's not lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, and I have found myself in both of my institutions sort of fighting to be heard because we were a smaller program. And so I think it's important to make sure it's a center that really has deep expertise in the care of skin cancer. And then I think obviously, just being aware. So, I keep forgetting this in my own practice, but there are registries out there like the Rare Registry or Vision OM that just by, you can just be advancing just by being part of the registry. Yeah. So I think that there's, a lot of, really exciting initiatives that we're all working together on, which is really what it's about at the end of the day. We have just a few minutes left, and I want to see if the audience has any questions.
Yes. Sometime during this discussion, somebody mentioned that when a clinical trial ends, that there's a gap before the drug is available, I guess. I have a daughter right now that's on a clinical trial. She's been on it now for about a year. She has no other options. This is it. Part of this trial, of course, is trying to determine the efficacy of the drug. But when this trial ends, how long is that gap, if indeed the drug proves to be effective? How long is this gap before?
So usually if the patient's already on the study and they're proven to be benefiting, there's some mechanism to continue providing that. And although I have noticed in the past, we would create what was called a rollover protocol, and now I find that a lot of, especially smaller pharmaceutical sponsors, are putting the work back on the institution and making us write our own protocol to do that. That's paperwork, and but most of the time there is some mechanism if the patient's benefiting. I think the situation I was referring to is if a trial has closed and you've not gotten a slot on the study, there may be a lag between when the FDA looks at the data and approves things. And in those cases, there are sometimes things called an expanded access protocol, which can be opened, but it's tricky. And expanded access programs are, talking Dr. Shastari about the corporate clinical research culture, they're notoriously underfunded. So that can be very difficult to, navigate that gap. And then even sometimes once a therapy is approved, although I've seen this, institutions develop ways around this over the years, there's something called a J-code that Medicare assigns, and sometimes it's even difficult to order a drug as a physician if the J-code hasn't been, processed or around for a bit. So there are obstacles that we face even with newly approved therapy sometimes.
Okay.
For one more question.
While you guys were participating in these trials, was there any interaction with other participants? Was there opportunity for camaraderie, or were you aware of outcomes of other patients? And if so, how did that affect your involvement?
Mine, I didn't have because it was a phase 2, so the number of patients that were on there were kind of not just at MD Anderson, there were some around, so we really didn't have any camaraderie with that. And I think the thing with that also is that, and I know talking with my care team, they would come in and tell me, hey, do you mind if we share how well you're doing if we're trying to get another patient on it, right? I said, go right ahead. Absolutely. Because a lot of times there were some patients that couldn't handle the toxicity of what was the clinical trial was. So to give them, and maybe they'd have to wait, till their numbers with their, blood work and that got better to where they could go back on or get another treatment that is not back on. But it just gave them more hope in that. So I had no problem. Even when I was going through treatment, I would come up and sit and talk to let patients know, because it was so new. And mine was such a, stage 4 brain mets, people always want to run away from, but it was showing and giving hope. And so when I could do that, we could do that, but there was no camaraderie as in face-to-face or talking. And one of the things is I also felt a little guilty at points because I was doing so well and I was hearing that some patients were not. So that's why I kept very till that. Now for advocacy now and before and going through my experience, I wanted people to have the opportunity to at least get in a clinical trial or hear from somebody that was on one. So that's what I did.
Yeah, I had a certain amount of survivor's guilt for a while before I really started talking about it. And I had to, just by chance on my own, a few years or a year or so after I left the hospital, would start bumping into some people. But there's only a total of 153 people in this trial and only 12 with mucosal melanoma. And so I didn't really come across anybody and everything I really wanted to, but it's just there wasn't that many people in the trial. And so it's one of those things to where if you try, and reach out, you might find somebody, but if you don't, then you definitely won't. And so you only miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And so if I made it, that'd be great, but if I didn't, then at least, my data would help support, research and, further better people like in the future, win, lose, or draw, no matter what, it still benefits, the better good of, humanity at the end of the day. And so, but that's just kind of a community that you ended up, building with, over time, with the other types of melanoma, rare subtypes and everything. So, I'd always encourage that camaraderie. It's just, it's the best kind of therapy I think that you can get.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we're at time, so thank you, everybody, for your attention. Thank you for sharing your stories.